The why we simply do not know. How we are beginning to suspect we can make a few statements about without being entirely ridiculous. The recent findings in connection with this subject also present us with another definite problem. Let us assume for a moment that our anthropologists are somewhere near correct in their assumption that man moved from a survival foundation to a cultural foundation not less than 100,000 years ago, and probably considerably earlier. If this is the case, why are we so peculiarly and mysteriously devoid of the connecting links which bind what we might term the growth of culture to the flowering of culture? When we study a child, we may have some record, either in memory or by the old family photograph album, and we can say this was Willie when he was 5, and this was Willie when he was 6, and this is the way Willie looked when he had his first summer camp, and this is the way Willie looked when he went to college. We have all of this information. But in the case of man, we do not have this information. We say this is the way Willie looked when he was born. This is the way Willie looked when he was grown up. We have nothing between. When I say we have nothing between, I mean by this nothing that the grown-up Willie begins perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era in terms of anthropology. Grown-up Willie rises to our attention with Egypt, with the ancient Indic foundations of culture in the Trans-Himalayan, with the rise of the earliest cultures of China. We perceive a tremendous flowering. We see the builders of the pyramid. We know from the study of their works that they were not merely infants with prodigious strength, that they possessed knowledge, integrated knowledge, scientific knowledge. This in itself is a very strange and somewhat wonderful circumstance, because it represents the attainment of a certain cultural platform. We are perfectly willing, or perhaps a little grudgingly willing, to acknowledge there were some pretty smart people 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. It is humiliating, but we will ultimately get around to it. That is not so bad. But what about the people 10,000 years ago? We have nothing to link them with the rise of Egypt. We have speculation, yes, but that is all. We do not know the steps that led up to the dawn of historic culture as we know it. We know they must have been there. We know that there has to have been a cause for the effect that followed. We know that man did not suddenly step through a curtain from nowhere, but we do have what is called the dark curtain of history. And this dark curtain covers the backstage of a situation that is most intriguing, but about which we are almost totally without knowledge.
Hey, boy. Think you can find something for me?
We must assume one of several
Any
things.
bad guys around, buddy?
First, that in some strange and mysterious way, what we might term culture was quickened at a certain time. And out of an abysmal lack of itself, or debility of itself, there came a sudden and incredible flowering. The next possibility is that there was an unbroken line of historical ascent and cultural ascent behind Egypt, and that for some reason we have not been able to rediscover the remains or evidences thereof. It is intriguing, however, that we should be also so frustrated in many other areas. We might assume that the possibility of the tides and times which have removed so many monuments, sweeping away some, But how do we explain the sweeping away of all? Why is it if we cannot find anything in Egypt, we are no better off in China? Why is it that we cannot move any of these civilizations and cultures back beyond a certain point? If we go behind that point far enough, we pick up culture again. We pick up culture 25,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. We find evidences of ancient culture in crude drawings on the walls of caves in Spain and France. We find carved bits of bone and broken artifacts that tell us something of the people who lived very long ago. But in between, there is this strange, incredible, inscrutable darkness. And up to now, we have not been able to penetrate it. So we pass over it with a few generalities. Generalities which also are likely to be subject to constant change and modification as time goes on. Also on the general field of our subject, we realize that in the clouded wall of what we might term this black curtain of history, this mist that hangs over the origin of everything, this same mist that hangs over the inner life of man, dividing the visible from the invisible, a mist of oblivion rather than of darkness, a mist of unknowns and uncertainties, a strange wall of emptiness which is more firm and more solid than any wall that we know in this world, a wall which we strive desperately to break through, only to break ourselves in the attempt. Sometime man will break through, but up to the present time he has not been able to do so. So we now have a parallel phenomenon accompanying this, and that is that right against this curtain, this dark curtain, as though against a motion picture screen, an incredible fantasy unfolds. For just at the point where history vanishes into the darkness of prehistory stands a tremendous pageantry of shadows which we call myths. Myths and legends. Someone has said that mythology is the history of the prehistoric world. But this rise of a world of legends, legends that are distributed throughout the world, legends dealing with the sources of things, and also in an intermediate way with other things, legends that certainly originated long ago, but passed gradually into embodiment in the earliest institutions of history as we know history. Legends of ancient times that perhaps move into embodiment in the heroes and the great persons who must have flourished at a comparatively remote time. Yet never do we find these heroes, these remote persons, either primitive or barbaric essentially, or different from the cultures which later developed around them. Had these heroes been different, the cultures would have been different, because these heroes became the archetypes or the patterns for the development of culture groups. Thus we find, for instance, standing against the background of Greek mystery, standing between the known and the unknown, the rising of great hero cycles, of which a good example is the cyclic myth of Hercules. Now Hercules was not a primitive being. He was not a neo-anthropoid. He was not a creature corresponding with the concept of the Cro-Magnon. He was not that kind of person at all. Hercules was a son of the gods. He was a great person. He was endowed not only with vast physical strength, but also with great skill, with wisdom, knowledge of arts and sciences. And he stood out to the Greek world as a truly heroic prototype of the satisfactory Grecian of at least one period in Greek thinking. who was Hercules? Was Hercules a deified mortal? Was he someone who lived long, long ago, perhaps in that shadowy land between history and prehistory? Was he a complete fabrication arising in the mind of Greece? Was he a dream symbol brought out of the unconscious or subconscious life of the Grecian people? We do not know with certainty the answers to these questions, but we gravely suspect, as psychology also points out, that it is very difficult for an individual to dream a complete fabrication, that he may distort, that he may confuse, that he may bring patterns out of focus and out of harmony with each other. But psychology would be inclined to suspect that man cannot dream totally apart from his own experience. Therefore, if he could dream of Hercules long, long ago, there had to be something within himself which made the establishment of this archetypal concept possible. Yet at the time when very likely this dream was being brought into expression, we are not in a position to assume that man possessed the environmental circumstances that would have made the Hercules dream possible. This presents another very confusing element of our pattern. So let us divide for the moment our world into the unfolding of history, which is nothing more or less than the story of the unfolding of culture. That behind this is this mysterious middle region between history and prehistory, and there stands the great cycle of the myths, from Hesiod, the Vedas, the great teachings and mysteries of Assyria and Chaldea and Babylon, the wonderful legendary lore of China, and even some of the prehistoric myths of our own Western Hemisphere. Then behind the myths we have what looks to be a very prosaic world, a world of very commonplace things, of flint axes, and of long, difficult struggles with saber-toothed tigers, and man struggling for fire, struggling for the domestication of animals, and following one anthropological thinking, working for perhaps several million years to find out that he could make a friend out of a dog. These kind of things were all there. We find him weaving and making rough pottery. We find him gaining such extraordinary self-modesty as to begin to wrap animal skins around his body. Whether for protection, ornamentation, or morality, we do not know. We suspect that it began with protection, passed from there to ornamentation, and only became a problem of morality after he himself became corrupt. This is the way these things have a tendency to develop. So we have a kind of a strange stage on which we have to set our play. If we are not too questioning, we have no problems. The moment we begin to question, we have no answers. But such is life. Out of this, we will proceed to the next situation that we are concerned with. Actually, science is not at all certain as to how man came into being. So actually, they depend today very heavily upon the Greek thinking. Now, we have a belief or general feeling that the Greeks were the greatest mythologists of all time, that there was no group of people that could spin more elaborate fantasies than our Grecian forebears. And they point out such delightful episodes as Zeus turning himself into a white bull and abducting Europa, and things of that kind, and to follow the statement of one small boy studying it, they had the awfulest imaginations. Actually, however, the Greeks were a very sensible people. And that means that someday their mythology will have to be completely reestimated. They were not the kind of people who were foolishly following any doctrine or belief. Arthur Murray of the Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities, the British Museum, tells us that in the Greek we have the story of the creation of man, and that perhaps of all peoples the Greeks were the only ones who said that the development of the species did not begin with a single pair of persons. This is one of their more or less unique contributions. The Greeks, in their own simple, natural way, divided this concept to assume that man appeared simultaneously in a number of areas. That man was not merely one generation, but it was a kind of species. And even among the Greeks themselves, there are separate, or worse, separate, distinct creation myths for the different provinces of Greece. The Greeks did not feel that they descended entirely from one pair of human beings. They believed that at a very remote time, by various circumstances, man came into existence in many places. Therefore, they assumed that it was scientifically reasonable that human beings were different even from the beginning. That these differences to the Greeks were not qualitative in the sense of one being having greater aptitudes, attributes, or more worthy of honor than another, but simply that they were different. And our early Greek thinkers in this matter were quite ingenious. They assumed that these different beings arose in different regions and therefore were immediately exposed to the pressure of regional conditions. Thus, long before they had attained even anthropological adolescence, those who dwelt or were originating in mountainous areas were different from those in valleys or by the shores of the sea. Persons in tropical regions different from those in frigid regions. And the Greeks had already discovered that climate and location were tremendous forces in the individualization of man. Now, they did not attempt to explain all the mysteries thereof, but they took it rather for granted that humanity was a kind of creature, that it appeared in various regions, that these regions became distinctly and definitely associated with the races, tribes, and clans that originated in those regions, and that growth was the natural unfoldment of men in the places where they were, and that the secondary factor of growth was the gradual awareness of other men, and the mingling and bringing together of these different groups under various types of sociological pressure. The Greeks got about that far, and that is as far as they were able to go with that particular phase of the subject, although this does not exhaust their whole thinking on it by any means. It would not be easy to quickly exhaust the thinking of Hesiod or the thinking of Plato on such problems as this. The Greeks in many regions had their legends and their myths. One of the most common of these, of course, is in share with nearly all others, namely that there were two distinct creations. That there was a creation preceding a kind of universal deluge. That there was then a creation following this deluge. That there was somewhere in the ancient form and time of things a race or an order of life of human nature and structure, at least capable of those moral delinquencies which we associate peculiarly with humanity and no other creature, by which the wrath of deities came to bring about a deluge
Yes?
or a destruction
Back again?
in punishment
Time to
for
do
sin.
business?
I've got a
And
few
that
minutes
this
to browse.
ancient
Always
order of
happy to
life
make you
vanished away. The second concept of the Greeks relating to this was the replenishment of man. Not the origin, but the re-origin, or the secondary appearance of man. And one of the most familiar and common legends relating to this among these people is the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. This legend tells that these two, the human survivors of the deluge, consulted an ancient oracle to find out how the earth should be replenished. And the oracle told them to cast behind themselves the bones of their mother. And for a long time they were not certain what was meant. Then they realized, or are made to realize, that the mother was the earth. Therefore, that the bones of the mother could be rocks. So they each took rocks and cast them back over their shoulders. And these rocks that were cast by the man became men, and those that were cast by the woman became women.